Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I work as a cataloger for a university's ancient artifacts department, which sounds more glamorous than it really is. Most of the time, I'm buried in poorly labeled crates from old excavations. My job is to photograph, document, and classify objects so researchers can study them. It's usually monotonous and solitary work. But last semester, I came across something that's haunted me ever since. One Friday evening, I stayed late to finish a shipment that had been sitting unopened for decades. The box was marked private collection, provenance unknown, and listed no details. Curious, I cracked it open. Inside were a few clay tablets, some fragments of carved bone, and a small bronze figure. Nothing unusual. The last object I unwrapped was a polished stone disc about the size of a dinner plate. It was unnervingly smooth, with concentric grooves etched into its surface. At the center was a spiral, deep and sharp enough to feel with my fingertip. As I turned it over, I saw there was writing along the edge, symbols I didn't recognize. I set the disc under the photography lights and zoomed in. The symbols didn't match any of the scripts I'd seen before, but they seemed oddly familiar. I started feeling dizzy the longer I stared at them. My stomach churned, and my head throbbed like I was coming down with the flu. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt. I decided to call it a night, but when I went to put the disc back in the crate, I noticed something strange. The grooves were glowing faintly, as though there were ember burning beneath the surface. Thinking it was just a trick of the light, I turned off the lamps. The glow didn't stop. That was enough for me. I packed the disc back into the crate and locked up. As I left, I told myself to report the artifact first thing Monday morning. That night, I couldn't sleep. My dreams were filled with swirling shapes and muffled whispers, too faint to understand. When I woke up, my head was pounding and the whispering didn't stop. I could hear it faintly, like static, just on the edge of perception. I was sure I was coming down with something. By Sunday, the whispers were louder, though still indecipherable. Worse, I started catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that darted away whenever I turned my head. I convinced myself it was just stress and lack of sleep. On Monday morning, I went straight to the lab. I was eager to get rid of that artifact, to pass it off to someone else and be done with it. But when I unlocked the storage room, the crate was gone. I reported it missing to campus security, but they found no signs of a break-in. None of my coworkers had seen it. It was as though the crate had never been there. The whispers persisted for weeks, fading only when I was around other people. The shadows, too, grew bolder, flitting across my walls at night, always just beyond reach. I eventually transferred to another department. Over time, I tried convincing myself it was all in my head. I told myself that the stress of overworking, the isolation of my job, and the eerie nature of the artifacts had combined to mess with my perception. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just stress. Something had followed me, and it was patient. Months passed, and while the shadows grew less frequent, they never completely vanished. The scratching at my door became sporadic. Sometimes weeks would go by without a sound, only for it to return, louder and more deliberate. I began sleeping with headphones in, playing white noise loud enough to drown it out. Then one night, everything changed. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy, I reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was a notification from the university's internal alert system. Unauthorized access detected in the artifact storage lab. Security en route. My stomach dropped. That lab was supposed to be locked tight. After the incident with the missing crate, extra security measures had been put in place. I knew better than to get involved, but something about the message gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I got dressed and drove to campus. The building was eerily silent when I arrived, lit only by dim emergency lights. As I approached the lab, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, swinging gently as though someone had just passed through. I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the lab was a mess. Shelves were overturned, papers scattered everywhere. At the center of the chaos was the missing crate, or what was left of it. The wood was splintered, as though something had burst out from inside. The stone disc lay on the floor, its grooves glowing faintly once again. I froze, unsure whether to move forward or run. That's when I noticed the air around the disc. It shimmered like heat rising from pavement, though the room was cold. And then I saw it, a shadow taller than any human, twisting and writhing as it emerged from the spiral etched into the disc. Its form was impossible to describe, shifting constantly as if it couldn't decide on a shape. What I could see, though, were the eyes, dozens of them, scattered across its body, glowing faintly like the grooves on the disc. They fixed on me. I backed away, nearly tripping over a fallen chair. My breath caught as the shadow extended something resembling an arm toward me. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. They weren't incomprehensible anymore. They were calling my name. I don't remember running, but I must have, because I found myself outside in the parking lot, gasping for air. Security arrived moments later, but I didn't stick around to explain. I drove home and packed a bag, leaving town that same night. I quit my job at the university and moved halfway across the country. It's been a year now, and I haven't heard the whispers or seen the shadows since. But sometimes, late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. The feeling of being watched never truly left. Even after moving, even after trying to rebuild a normal life, there were moments when I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. Sometimes it was in my own home, a fleeting sensation of something just beyond the edge of perception. Other times it was in public, as if I were a faint signal being tracked, no matter where I went. It happened again a few weeks ago. I had just settled into a new city, a smaller place where I could blend in, surrounded by people but anonymous. I'd gone to a local bookstore, hoping to lose myself in the comforting smell of old paper and the quiet hum of life. As I browsed the shelves, a voice called my name. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't out of place. The casual, almost friendly hey, as if someone familiar had just spotted me. I turned, my heart racing, expecting to see someone I knew. But no one was there. The aisle was empty. I shook it off, forcing myself to believe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone else at the store had the same name. I paid for my books and left quickly, scanning every shadow on my way to the car. That night, I had a nightmare. In the dream, I was back in the lab, standing over the broken crate. The disc was glowing brighter now, its grooves swirling faster, almost alive. The shadow emerged again, more defined this time, its shifting form coalescing into something humanoid but still wrong. Its eyes, those countless, glowing eyes, locked onto mine. "You can't run," it said. The voice wasn't like the whispers I'd heard before. It was deep, layered, and reverberated in my chest like an earthquake. "You opened the way." I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. For a moment, I thought I could still hear it breathing in the room, but it was only the sound of the wind against my window. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The next day, things escalated. I'd taken to avoiding mirrors since all of this began. They always made me uneasy, as if the reflection wasn't quite right. But that morning, I accidentally glanced at myself in the bathroom mirror, and I froze. My reflection was smiley. I wasn't. My mouth was frozen in shock, but the image staring back at me was grinning, wide and unnatural, like it knew something I didn't. My hands trembled as I backed away, but the reflection didn't move. It just stood there, grinning. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, before I grabbed a towel and threw it over the mirror. I haven't uncovered it since. Now, I don't sleep much. I've started noticing patterns, things out of place in my apartment, objects I know I didn't move. A chair slightly angled toward the bed, a book left open to pages I didn't read, and the whispers, they're back. Louder now, closer. I've been trying to research what I might have released, but every avenue leads to dead ends or descriptions that chill me to my core. Whatever this thing is, it's ancient and it's patient. It knows I'm afraid, and I think it enjoys that. 2 nights ago, I woke up to the sound of my front door unlocking. I live alone, and the door has 3 deadbolts. I locked them all before going to bed, but as I lay there, frozen in my bed, I heard each bolt slide back, one by one. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, waiting. The door didn't open. There were no footsteps, no intruder, just silence. When I finally gathered the courage to check, the door was closed, the bolts were locked, and no one was there. But on the floor, just inside the door, was a small object wrapped in cloth. It was the disc. I haven't touched it. I don't know how it found me, but it's here, waiting. Hey, whatever came with it, I know it's not far behind. If you're reading this, and you ever come across something ancient, something unmarked or unexplained, don't touch it. Don't try to study it. Just leave it alone. I was in college, and one of my favorite things to do to distress was go to old, small theaters around the city. There was this particular one that played classic films once a month. It had a single screen, red velvet seats, and these faded gold embellishments along the walls. The building was ancient but charming, and I always found it comforting until one night in November. The film showing that night was Casablanca. It wasn't too crowded, which I liked. I bought my ticket, grabbed some popcorn, and found a seat in the middle row. When I settled in, I noticed someone sit 2 seats away from me, a man in a gray coat and dark scarf. He was unremarkable but polite, nodding slightly when I glanced his way. The movie started, and I was immediately absorbed, but about 30 minutes in, I noticed something odd. Every time there was a quiet moment in the film, I thought I heard whispering. It was faint, just barely audible, but enough to be distracting. At first, I assumed it was the man in the gray coat, maybe talking to himself or on his phone, but when I turned to look, he wasn't there anymore. His set was empty. I figured he must have gone to the restroom, so I refocused on the movie. me. The whispering didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was pounding. It wasn't just random muttering, it was rhythmic, almost like a chant. And then came this weird, subtle pressure like the air in the theater was heavier. I turned to look behind me. Nothing. No one was in the row directly behind mine. I looked back at the seat where the man had been sitting, still empty, but something about it seemed off. The way the light from the screen hit it made the fabric look darker than the others, like it had absorbed shadows that refused to let go. And then the seat creaked. My stomach flipped. No one was there. I don't know what possessed me, but I reached over and pressed my hand onto the seat's armrest. It was cold. Not the AC is on cold. I see. The whispering stopped instantly, like someone had clapped a hand over their mouth. I yanked my hand back and froze, staring at the seat, willing it to just be a trick of my imagination. The movie ended shortly after, and the lights came up. The theater was nearly empty by then, but I was too shaken to move. When the usher came to clean the aisles, I pointed to the seat and asked, "Did someone leave in the middle of the movie?" He frowned. "Not from this row." Why, I didn't know how to respond. Instead, I just stood and hurried out of the theater. I didn't go back to that place again, but I looked it up later. Turns out, it had a long history, including a fire decades ago that killed several people during a screening. And yeah, one of the victims had been sitting right in the seat I chose that night. After I left the theater that night, I tried to shake off the experience. I chalked it up to nerves, maybe a little leftover stress from school, but something about the whispering, the way it stopped so abruptly when I touched the seat, lingered in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. For weeks, I avoided that part of town. I even skipped the next month's classic movie screening, which hurt because it was one of my favorite traditions. But life went on, and soon I managed to convince myself it had been a weird coincidence. Maybe I imagined the whispers. Maybe the cold state was just poor heating. I moved all in until the postcards started showing up. It began innocuously enough. One afternoon, I found a plain white postcard in my campus mailbox. There was no return address, no stamp, just my name written on the front in neat, blocky handwriting. I turned it over. The only thing written on the back was a single word, "Remember." It gave me chills, but I figured it was a prank. College kids were weird, right? Maybe someone had overheard me talking about the theater incident and decided to mess with me. I shrugged it off, but then, a week later, another card came. This time, the handwriting was different, still blocky, but shakier, like the person was in a rush or unsteady. The word on the back said, "Stay." I told myself it was probably still a joke, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. Who was leaving this? And why? I started locking my dorm room door religiously, even during the day. I told a few friends about it, and they laughed it off, telling me I was probably being paranoid. But the third card was the worst. I found it wedged in the crack of my dorm room door late one evening. This time, it wasn't just a single word, it was a sentence. The handwriting was different again, jagged and frantic, like whoever wrote it was pressing down too hard with the pen. It said, "You shouldn't have touched it." I dropped the card like it was burning my hand. My stomach sank. I had never told anyone about touching the seat. Not my friends, not even the usher I talked to that night. I hadn't told a soul. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my desk lamp on and sat up in bed, staring at my door, clutching my phone. Around 2 a.m., I swore I heard fate whispering again. Not in my room, but somewhere outside, maybe down the hall. It was the same rhythmic murmur I'd heard in the theater. I wanted to cry, but I was too terrified to move. The postcard stopped after that night. No more words, no more whispers. I never figured out who sent them, and honestly, I didn't want to. I graduated a few years later and moved far away. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I still hear that faint, rhythmic whispering, just barely audible over the hum of life. I don't know what I touched in that theater, or what followed me after, but one thing's for sure, wherever it came from, it hasn't completely let go. Years passed, and life carried on. I moved to a new city, started a steady job, and built a routine. The memory of that theater incident dulled with time, like a bad dream you could almost convince yourself didn't happen. I never saw another postcard, and the whispering became so rare and faint that I could almost dismiss it as my imagination. Almost. But then, about a month ago, I got a package. It was a nondescript brown box, left at my apartment door with no return address. The sight of it immediately set me on edge. Something about its weight in my hands felt wrong. I debated throwing it out unopened, but my curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single item, an old, scratched movie ticket. It wasn't from the theater I'd visited all those years ago, but it was similar enough to make my chest tighten. The date on the ticket was from 1943, the year of the fire I'd read about. The title of the film was illegible, smudged into oblivion, but I recognized the name of the theater, and that wasn't the worst part. The seat number printed on the ticket was the same one I had sat in, row F, seat 13. My hand shook as I stared at the ticket. Why was this being sent to me now? After all these years, why couldn't this thing, whatever it was, leave me alone? I shoved the box and its contents into a closet, slammed the door, and tried to forget about it, but ignoring it didn't work. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering again. again, louder this time and unmistakable. It was in my apartment, coming from the closet where I'd stuffed the ticket. The whispers were no longer faint or indistinct. They were sharp, clear words, though not in any language I could recognize. It sounded like a crowd speaking in unison, overlapping and echoing like they were in a cavern. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. At sunrise, I opened the closet, grabbed the ticket and the box, and drove them to the nearest dumpster. I threw them in, covered them with trash, and drove away, thinking I'd rid myself of it. But when I got home, the box was sitting on my kitchen counter. I froze. My front door was locked. My windows were latched. There was no way anyone could have gotten in, and yet there it was, the box with that cursed ticket inside. I knew then that this wasn't something I could escape. Whatever I disturbed in that theater, it had attached itself to me like a parasite. I didn't know what it wanted, but it was growing bolder, more insistent. Over the following days, the whispers escalated. They followed me everywhere, on my commute, at work, even in the middle of conversations. Sometimes they'd stop for hours, and I'd think I was free, only for them to return louder and angrier than before. Shadows in my apartment began to feel deeper, like they were watching me, shifting when I wasn't looking. My reflection in the mirror didn't always move with me. And every morning, the box would appear somewhere new in my apartment, no matter where I left it the night before. I don't know how much longer I can take this. Writing this is my last hope. Maybe someone will recognize what's happening to me or know how to stop it, because it's not just the whispers anymore. Last night, I woke up to a pressure on my chest. My bedroom was pitch black, and the air was freezing. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, but I could feel it, something heavy and cold sitting on me, pressing down like it wanted to crush my lungs. Into the dark, I heard the whispering again, so close it felt like it was inside my head. Before I passed out, I swear I heard one word rise above the rest: stay. Last summer, my friends and I attended a small music festival in a sleepy mountain town. The event sprawled across the town square, with food trucks, artisan booths, and two main stages set against a backdrop of towering pines. It was a warm, golden evening, and the atmosphere was relaxed, kids chasing bubbles, couples swaying to the music, and groups like I was lounging on picnic blankets. About halfway through the evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, I decided to wander off on my own. The crowd had thickened, and I wanted to explore the smaller vendors tucked into the side streets. One booth caught my eye. It wasn't flashy like the others, just a simple wooden table with a few small sculptures displayed. The vendor, a man in his late 50s, stood silently behind it. He wasn't interacting with anyone, just watching the festival with an expression that felt out of place, detached. I walked up to get a closer look at the sculptures, which were strange but captivating. They were small figures, maybe 6 inches tall, carved from wood. Each was posed in a way that felt unsettling. One was crouched as if hiding, another reaching upward like it was trapped in an invisible box. There was one figure in particular that caught my attention, a woman sitting on the ground, her head buried in her knees. "Do you make this?" I asked, trying to break the silence. The man looked at me for the first time. His eyes were sharp, like he was studying me. After a pause, he nodded. "They're beautiful," I said, though beautiful wasn't the right word. "They were haunting." "Take one," he said, his voice flat. "Low, I don't have cash," I replied quickly. "Take it," he repeated, this time pushing the sitting woman's sculpture toward me. His hand was steady, but I noticed a faint tremble in his fingers. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to refuse, but something in his tone made me uneasy. I thanked him awkwardly and walked away with the sculpture tucked under my arm. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but when I got back to the Arab later that night, I finally had time to examine the sculpture more closely. It was intricately detailed, more than I'd realized. The folds in the woman's dress, the strands of her hair, the tension in her hands as they gripped her knees. It was remarkable, but it also gave me the creeps. I decided to leave it on the table in the living room. That night, I woke up to a soft sound, like someone shuffling through the house. My first thought was that one of my friends had gotten up, but when I listened more closely, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the hallway or the kitchen. It was coming from the living room. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and tiptoed down the hall. The shuffling stopped as soon as I reached the living room doorway. The light from a nearby street lamp cast long shadows across the room, and everything seemed normal except the sculpture. It was no longer on the table where I left it. It was on the floor, tipped onto its side. I stared at it, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe one of my friends had moved it, but when I checked, they were all still asleep. The next morning, I brought the sculpture back to the festival, determined to return it. But when I reached the spot where the man's booth had been, it was gone. I asked a nearby vendor if they knew where he went, but they gave me a confused look. There wasn't anyone there yesterday, they said. I didn't take the sculpture home with me. I left it on a bench near the square and walked away as quickly as I could. After leaving the sculpture on the bench, I felt a weight lift off my chest, but uneasily lingered. The festival carried on in the distance, cheerful music and laughter drifting through the warm air. I tried to shake the whole thing off as a weird, isolated incident, convincing myself it was nothing more than a misunderstanding, though deep down, I wasn't so sure. When I returned to the airbroom later, my friends asked where I disappeared to. I just said I'd gone for a walk and didn't mention the sculpture or the strange vendor. They would have thought I was overreacting. Besides, I didn't want to give my paranoia any more fuel. We packed up and left the next morning. As the car wooed its way down the mountain roads, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the quiet man standing by the roadside, watching us leave. Of course, there was no sign of him. Weeks passed, and life went back to normal. I had almost convinced myself that the whole thing was just my imagination. But then, one night, I was home alone, working late on my laptop. I had the TV on in the background, and my cat was curled up on the couch beside me. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard it, the faint sound of shuffling. My heart dropped. It was the same sound I'd heard in the air, but the soft, deliberate movement of something or someone. I froze, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. At first, I thought it might be my cat, but when I turned to look at her, she was staring intently at the doorway, ears flat against her head. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the hallway. I grabbed my phone and stood up slowly, my entire body on high alert. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer, just the oppressive silence of my empty house. Summoning all my courage, I crept toward the hallway, every step making my heart pound harder. When I reached the doorway, I flicked on the light and looked around. Nothing. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. The house was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Later that night, as I was trying to fall asleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, expecting a late night text from a friend, but when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. It was a photo. The image showed my living room, taken from the perspective of someone standing in the hallway. In the center of the photo, on the coffee table where I left it weeks ago, was the sculpture, the sitting woman, her head buried in her knees. I stared at the photo in disbelief, my mind racing. I knew I had left the sculpture at the festival. There was no way it could have found its way back to me. Before I could think too much, another text came through. This one was a message, just 3 words: "She's not yours." That night, I didn't sleep. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and drove to a friend's house, not stopping until I was safely inside. When I tried to show them the photo the next morning, it was gone from my phone as if it had never existed. The following weeks were some of the most unsettling of my life. Though I was staying with my friend, trying to feel safe again, strange things started to happen. It began subtly. Doors that I was sure I'd locked were slightly ajar when I returned. Lights flickered at odd times, though their wiring had never been an issue before. My cat, usually calm and friendly, began to hiss at empty corners of the room, her fur bristling for no apparent reason. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. Stress could explain a lot, right? Maybe I was just so on edge that I was noticing things I normally wouldn't. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I finally decided I couldn't let the paranoia take over my life anymore. I went back to my house, determined to prove to myself that nothing was actually going on. My friend offered to come with me, but I declined. I didn't want to drag anyone else into whatever this was. I got home just before dusk. Everything looked exactly as I had left it, calm, ordinary. I walked through each room, checking every corner, every closet, every space where someone or something could hide. It was empty. I sat down on the couch, relieved, and decided to make myself some tea to help me relax. That's when I saw it. Sitting in the center of my kitchen table was the sculpture, the same one I left on the bench at the festival, the same one that had supposedly been in that eerie photo. The woman was still in her haunting pose, head buried in her knees, but now something was different. Her hands, which had been gripping her knees tightly before, were now slightly outstretched, almost as if she was reaching for something or someone. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away from the table. My mind raced. There was no way it could have been here. I had left it behind. I had seen it gone. In a moment of sheer panic, I grabbed the sculpture and threw it into a garbage bag. I tied the bag tightly, drove to the edge of town, and dumped it in a random dumpster behind a strip mall. I drove back home with shaking hands, convincing myself it was over. Whatever had been happening was connected to that sculpture, and now it was finally gone. But it wasn't. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It wasn't loud, more like a soft murmur just on the edge of my hearing. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and scanned the room. I didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed the faintest movement near the foot of my bed. The sculpture was there, but this time it was different. The figure had shifted. She wasn't sitting anymore. She was standing, her head still bowed but her arms now fully outstretched, as if she were reaching for me. I screamed, grabbed my phone, and bolted out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, locking the doors and fumbling to call my friend. When they picked up, I was in tears, trying to explain what was happening. They told me to stay put, and they'd come get me. I waited in that car for what felt like hours, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone approaching. When my friend finally arrived, I jumped out and collapsed into their arms, too shaken to speak. The next day, we went back to the house together. The sculpture was gone, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. This happened about 3 years ago when I was working as a horticultural assistant at a botanical garden. It was my first real job after college, and I loved spending my days surrounded by plants. Most of my tasks were fairly mundane: pruning, watering, pest control, but every so often we get special assignments. One of these involved an old greenhouse on the far edge of the property. It hadn't been used in decades and was mostly overgrown with ivy and moss. Management had decided to restore it for a historical tour series, and my boss asked me to start clearing it out. I've been inside once before on a guided walkthrough, and though it was dusty and damp, it seemed straightforward enough: remove debris, clear out overgrown plants, and take inventory of what was salvageable. On my first day working there alone, I arrived mid-morning with my supplies. The sun was bright, and the glass walls of the greenhouse made it feel like an oven. The work was harder than I anticipated. Some of the roots had grown deep into the floor, and I kept finding nests of insects in the soil trays. By early afternoon, I was sweaty, tired, and regretting not bringing a second water bottle. I was working on one of the back corners, clearing out a shelf of rusted gardening tools, when I noticed something odd. A series of tiny, scratched markings ran along the edge of the shelf, almost like tally marks. Curious, I leaned closer and realized they weren't random. Someone had carved words between the lines. Don't let them out. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank or maybe a relic from when the greenhouse was still in use. Kids from nearby schools sometimes volunteered for gardening projects. Maybe one of them had a dark sense of humor. I brushed it off and went back to work. The second weird thing happened about an hour later. I was uprooting an old vine when I heard a noise, like a faint tapping. It was so soft I almost didn't notice it, but it came from above. Looking up, I saw nothing but sunlight filtering through the glass panes. I figured it was just a bird or a squirrel and went back to work. The tapping didn't stop. In fact, it got louder, more deliberate. It wasn't until I stood on my tiptoes to inspect the ceiling that I saw it, a perfectly round hole in one of the glass panes, about the size of a quarter. The tapping was coming from there, but nothing was on the other side. I remember feeling an odd chill despite the heat. As the afternoon wore on, the air inside the greenhouse grew stifling. I decided to call it a day and come back fresh in the morning. As I was gathering my tools, I noticed a second hole, this one in the lower pane of another wall. Unlike the first, this one had jagged edges, as though the glass had been pushed outward. That's when I realized something that made my stomach twist. The holes hadn't been there earlier in the day. I would have noticed them. I decided to leave, but as I was locking up the greenhouse door, I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, like I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around, scanning the interior, and that's when I saw it, a faint outline of a figure on the far side of the greenhouse, obscured by the overgrowth. It didn't move, didn't react, just stood there. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I bolted back to the main garden and reported everything to my boss, who promised to check it out the next day. When he came back, he said he didn't find anything, no figure, no new holes in the glass. He joked that I'd been working too hard and probably imagined it, but I knew what I saw. I refused to go back to that greenhouse, and thankfully I wasn't asked to. The restoration project was quietly cancelled a few weeks later. No explanation was given, but I heard whispers among the staff that a contractor had found something strange while surveying the foundation, something buried beneath the greenhouse that they wouldn't elaborate on. A few months after I quit working at the botanical garden, I bumped into one of my old coworkers, Sarah, at a coffee shop. We got to talking about the place, reminiscing about the plants, the staff, and some of the odd stories that circulated over the years. When the greenhouse came up, her face immediately darkened. "You heard about the incident, right?" she asked. I shook my head. I hadn't kept in touch with anyone after I left, so I had no idea what she was talking about. Sarah glanced around, as if to make sure no one was eavesdropping, then leaned in closer. "They were still trying to restore the greenhouse a few weeks after you left," she began. "The crew found more holes in the glass. Like, a lot of them, some so small you could barely see them, others big enough to stick your hand through. Management brought in an exterminator because they thought it was some kind of insect or pest making the damage." Sarah paused, her eyes wide. "But the exterminator, he didn't even make it through the first inspection. He walked in, took one look at the holes, and walked right back out. Didn't say a word to anyone, just packed up his gear and left." She told me that after that, the staff started avoiding the greenhouse altogether. People reported feeling uneasy whenever they got close to it. There were rumors of strange noises at night, scratching scratching, tapping, even whispers. Some said they saw movement through the glass, like shadows darting between the plants. A few brave souls tried to record it on their phones, but the footage always came out distorted. What about the foundation? I asked. I heard they found something under the greenhouse. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Yep, that's what finally shut everything down. They brought in a surveyor to assess the structural integrity of the place, and he found what looked like an old well under the floor. It was covered by a heavy stone slab, probably from when the greenhouse was first built. She leaned in even closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. When they lifted the slab, they found a staircase, a stone staircase leading down into the ground. I felt a cold shiver run through me. Did they go down? Sarah nodded again, but her expression was grim. They sent someone, a specialist, I guess. He didn't come back up. What? I whispered, my voice barely audible. They sent a second guy down after him. She continued, her hands trembling slightly around her coffee cup. He was only down there for a few minutes before he came running back up. Wouldn't say what he saw, just kept muttering, seal it up, seal it up. They poured concrete over the whole thing the next day and shut the greenhouse for good. I sat there, stunned, my mind racing. I thought about the figure I'd seen that day, the holes in the glass, the strange markings on the shelf. Suddenly, everything felt connected in a way I couldn't quite understand, but didn't want to. What do you think was down there? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Sarah just shook her head. I don't know, and I don't want to know. But after everything that's happened, I'm just glad they sealed it off. Despite Sarah's chilling account, I couldn't stop thinking about the greenhouse. The image of the figure in the shadows and the idea of a staircase leading into the ground gnawed at me. I wanted to forget, to dismiss it as a bad memory or a misunderstanding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. Months later, curiosity got the better of me. I found myself driving back to the botanical garden on a crisp fall afternoon. I told myself it was just a casual visit, a nostalgic trip to a place I used to love. But deep down, I knew why I was really there. The garden was as beautiful as ever, with its meticulously maintained flower beds and sprawling lawns. Families strolled the paths, and children laughed in the distance. For a moment, I felt silly, like I let my imagination get the best of me. But when I made my way to the far edge of the property, the atmosphere changed. The greenhouse stood there, silent and imposing. It looked the same as before, but there was something different about the air around it, something heavy, oppressive. A chain-link fence had been erected around it, with a sign reading "Do not enter hazardous area." The glass panes were grimy, and ivy had started reclaiming the structure, creeping over the roof like nature's attempt to erase it. I shouldn't have gone closer, but I did. My heart pounded as I approached the fence. Peering through the gaps, I scanned the interior. Most of the plants had withered or been removed, leaving behind empty pots and shelves. But then I noticed something odd. The floor wasn't fully covered in concrete. As Sarah had said, in the center of the greenhouse, there was a rectangular patch of dirt, untouched and bare. It was the exact spot where the well had been. That's when I saw it. A small hole in the center of the dirt, no bigger than a fist. It hadn't been there before. The edges looked fresh, like the earth had been pushed aside from below. My stomach turned as I watched the dirt around the hole shift, just slightly, like something beneath it was moving. A low, rhythmic tapping sound began, faint at first but growing louder. My breath hitched as I realized it was coming from beneath the ground. It wasn't random. It had a deliberate pattern: tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, like a signal. I stumbled back from the fence, heart racing, and nearly collided with someone. It was one of the security guards, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor. "You shouldn't be here," he said gruffly, his eyes narrowing. "Hi, I used to work here," I stammered. "I just wanted to see the greenhouse." His face softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "This area is off limits for a reason. You need to live." "What's going on with it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "What's under there?" The guard hesitated, his expression guarded. "You don't want to know. Trust me. Just go." I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't just annoyance or authority, it was fear. I left the garden that day and haven't returned since. But the memory of that hole, that sound, stays with me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I hear the tapping again. Soft, rhythmic, insistent. This happened when I was in college. Back in 2018, I was part of the student tech crew for events, which meant I spent a lot of time setting up equipment in the campus auditorium. It was a large, old space with rows of heavy, red velvet seats and a balcony that always seemed to be covered in a thin layer of dust no matter how often it was cleaned. One evening, we were setting up for a speaker event the following morning. It was around 8 p.m., and most of the campus was already deserted. My friend Josh was up in the control booth testing the lights while I worked on the stage, adjusting a podium mic. The auditorium was dim except for the spotlight shining on the stage. I heard it then, a soft creak from one of the seats. Not unusual, given how old the chairs were, but something about it made me pause. I glanced up and scanned the rows. No one yet. Josh, I called up to the booth. You hear that? Hear what? He replied over the comm system, his voice crackling slightly. Thought I heard one of the chairs move. He laughed. Relax, man, these seats are older than our parents. They grow if you even look at them. I shook it off and went back to work. A few minutes later, there it was again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just the sound of a chair settling, it was the distinct thunk of the seat flipping down, like someone had sat in it. I turned around sharply, my eyes scanning the auditorium. My skin prickled when I saw it. One of the seats, halfway back in the middle row, was down. Every other seat around it was upright. Josh, I hissed into my mic, there's a chair down. What? He sounded annoyed, probably thinking I was messy with him. I'm serious. Look at the middle row. Someone's sitting there. Josh turned the house lights up, flooding the room with harsh brightness. I blinked against the sudden glare, but when I looked back, the chair was upright again, as if nothing had happened. Dude, there's nothing there, Josh said, now sounding more exasperated than amused. I swear it was down. I muttered, whatever, let's just finish up. We worked for another hour or so, and I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The mind plays tricks when you're tired, right? But as we were packing up to leave, I glanced back one last time from the stage. That same chair was down again. I froze, feeling cold all over. Josh, I whispered, not taking my eyes off the seat. It's down again. Josh was already halfway out the door. He stuck his head back in and frowned at me. What are you? He followed my gaze and saw it too. His face went pale. We stood there in silence for a moment before the chair slowly flipped back up, the sound echoing through the empty auditorium. We bolted out of there without another word. The next day, I asked the janitor if he'd ever noticed anything strange about the auditorium. He gave me a long, tired look before saying, that chair. Yeah, it's been like that since I started here. No one likes to sit in it. When I pressed him for more details, he shrugged. Back in the 70s, some guy, student, I think, had a heart attack during a play. Died right in that chair. A couple of weeks later, I couldn't avoid the auditorium anymore. There was another event, and this time the whole tech crew was needed. We were setting up for a play, and I figured with more people around, I wouldn't feel so uneasy. I didn't tell anyone else what had happened, not even Josh. I didn't want to sound like I was losing it. The setup went smoothly. I managed to ignore that part of the room entirely, refusing to look in the direction of the chair. By the time we were done, it was late again, but I felt a bit braver. Nothing weird had happened, and maybe the janitor's story had just gotten under my skin. The play itself ran for 3 nights. On the second night, one of the actors, a senior named Ellie, approached me during intermission. She looked shaken. Hey, oh, have you noticed anything ... off in here? She asked. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Well, she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid someone might overhear. During the first act, I swear I saw someone sitting in the middle row, right in the middle, but when I glanced back, they were gone. I tried to act casual, though my palms were clammy. Maybe it was someone who left to use the bathroom. She shook her head. No, the house lights were down, and they weren't there before the show started. I thought I imagined it, but I don't know. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It felt weird, cold. I could see the hairs on her arms standing up, and I realized I'd been gripping my clipboard so hard my knuckles were white. I didn't tell her about the chair. I just mumbled something about how old buildings can feel creepy and quickly found a reason to walk away. That night, after the play ended and everyone cleared out, I lingered behind with Josh and a couple of other crew members to pack up some of the equipment. I couldn't stop glancing toward the chair, expecting it to move, or flip down, or do something, but it didn't. As we were locking up, Josh stopped suddenly at the exit. Hey, he said, his voice tight. Did any of you guys notice? There was an extra program on that chair tonight. What? I turned to look, but the house lights were already off. All I could see was a vague shape where the rows of chairs were. It was folded, just sitting there. Josh muttered, almost to himself. I thought maybe someone left it, but never mind. Let's get out of here. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went back to the auditorium during daylight, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. It was bright, quiet, and felt entirely normal. For a moment, I thought I was being ridiculous, and then I saw it. The chair was down, and on the seat was a single, folded program from the play. My heart started racing as I picked it up with trembling fingers. Scrawled on the back in messy handwriting was a single word, stay. After that final encounter, I was done with the auditorium. I swapped shifts with other tech crew members, avoided anything related to the space, and made it a point to never mention the incidents to anyone outside of Josh and Ellie. But as much as I wanted to forget about it, the chair didn't seem ready to let me go. A few weeks later, Ellie texted me late at night. Ellie, hey, did you ever notice anything weird with that chair? I stared at my phone, debating whether to respond. Finally, I typed out a cautious reply. Lee, why do you ask? She sent a picture. It was of the chair, down as always, with a folded playbill sitting on it. I felt a wave of nausea. The photo wasn't from the auditorium, it was taken from a study lounge on campus, one of those generic, quiet spaces where students cram during finals. The same chair, or one exactly like it, was now sitting in the corner of the room. Ellie, I swear this wasn't here earlier. No one else is here, and the janitor said he didn't move it. Is this the same chair? My heart raced. It wasn't possible. The auditorium's chairs were bolted to the floor, but the shape, the fabric, the scratches on the armrests, it was identical. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. The next morning, I went to the study lounge. The chair was gone. I asked Ellie about it, and she said the janitor claimed he had no idea where it came from or where it went. She brushed it off as a prank, but I could see in her eyes she didn't believe that. The thing is, that wasn't the last time I saw it. Over the next few months, the chair started appearing in random places around campus, the library, a corner of the dining hall, even in the hallway outside one of my classes. No one else seemed to notice anything strange about it, but every time I saw it, my chest tightened and my skin felt ice cold. The worst part, each time I saw it, there was something left on the seat. A pen, a crumpled piece of paper. Once, it was a single coin, all small, insignificant objects, until the last one. I was walking through the student union late one night, heading to grab something from the vending machines, when I saw it. The chair was sitting near the back of the room, almost hidden in the shadows. My heart sank as I realized there was another folded program on the seat. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I walked over, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The program looked old, the edges yellowed and frayed. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a photograph. It was black and white, grainy, and showed the auditorium as it must have looked decades ago. In the picture, the rows of chairs were full of people, but one figure stood out. In the middle row, directly where the chair would be, sat a man. He was slumped forward, his head turned slightly toward the camera, his expression blank and lifeless. I dropped the photo and backed away, my heart pounding. I couldn't bring myself to pick it up, couldn't even bring myself to stay in the room. I ran out and didn't look back. After that, the chair disappeared. No one mentioned it, and I never saw it again. I graduated and moved far away from campus, hoping that was the end of it. I was an attorney at a remote weather station deep in the Rocky Mountains. My job was mundane but peaceful, logging daily readings, checking instruments, and maintaining communication with the central office. The station itself was a small, squat building perched on a ridge, surrounded by endless wilderness. It was quiet up there, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. It was my 4th week into a 2-month assignment, and I had just settled into the routine. Days were spent taking readings, and nights were a mix of stargazing and reading. The station had a small kitchen, a single cot, and just enough equipment to keep me occupied. One evening, as the sun was sinking below the horizon, I stepped out to log the temperature and wind speed. The sky was a swirly mix of purple and gold, and the air had that sharp, biting chill that comes before nightfall. As I was jotting down the readings, I felt a sudden prickling at the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get when you know someone's watching. I froze, my breath misting in front of me. Slowly, I turned around. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the expanse of pine trees stretching into the distance. But then, about 30 yards away, I saw movement. A figure, partially obscured by the trees, standing utterly still. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't respond or move closer. They just stood there, motionless. Something about their posture was off, too stiff, like they were a mannequin propped up in the woods. I felt my stomach twist. After a minute of silence, I backed toward the station, keeping my eyes on the figure. Once inside, I locked the door and pulled the blinds. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was probably a hiker who got turned around. Still, the isolation of the place made it hard to shake the unease. That night, I tried to convince myself nothing was wrong, but as the hours ticked by, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. My blood ran cold. The blinds were closed, but the sound was unmistakable, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the glass. I sat frozen on the cot, clutching the radio I used to communicate with the central office. The tapping stopped after a few seconds, only to start again at another window. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the nearest window. Heart pounding, I yanked the blinds open and shone the light outside. Nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. The tapping continued sporadically for the rest of the night, always at a different window. I didn't sleep. By morning, the noises had stopped and everything seemed normal. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The following evening, I was determined to stay inside and keep the doors locked. But around 9 p.m., the power went out. The station plunged into darkness, and my stomach dropped. I grabbed the flashlight and radio, but before I could do anything, I heard a low, guttural sound coming from outside. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I could recognize. It sounded raw again. I pressed myself against the wall, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The noise moved closer, circling the station, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. The power returned a few hours later, but I didn't dare leave the station. I radioed the central office and reported strange activity, but they brushed it off as wildlife or my imagination. I tried to rationalize everything that happened, but it never quite added up. Sure, the mountains are home to wildlife, and power outages aren't unheard of in such remote locations. But that noise, it was something I couldn't explain, and the tapping. Animals don't do that. Not like that. When my assignment ended, I packed my things and left the station without looking back. The relief I felt as I drove down the windy mountain road was overwhelming, like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I was grateful to be heading back to civilization, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like unseen eyes were following me all the way down. Weeks passed, and I began to settle back into normal life. The events at the station started to feel like a bad dream, something my mind had exaggerated in the solitude. But then, about a month after my return, something happened that pulled me right back into that nightmare. I received a package in the mail with no return address. It was a plain cardboard box, sealed with cheap packing tape. Thinking it might be from one of my coworkers at the station, I'd opened it without much thought. Inside, I found a small, weathered notebook and a folded piece of paper. The notebook was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. It was filled with neat, handwritten entries, log notes, much like the ones I kept at the station. The entries spanned years, but they weren't mine. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Flipping through the pages, I realized the entries were from someone who had been stationed at the same weather outpost long before me. Most of the notes were standard, weather patterns, instrument readings, but as I got further into the notebook, the tone shifted. The writer started mentioning strange occurrences, figures in the woods, unexplained noises, tapping on the windows. My hand shook as I read the final entries. They were increasingly frantic, the handwriting erratic. The last entry was scrawled across an entire page in large, uneven letters. "It's not an animal. It knows I'm here. I can't leave." I unfolded the piece of paper that had come with the notebook. It was a single sentence, printed in bold letters. "You should have stayed away." I didn't know what to do. I contacted my former supervisor at the weather station and told him about the package. He sounded confused and a little uneasy, but assured me that no one had been stationed there before me for at least a decade. He suggested it might be some kind of elaborate prank, but his voice lacked conviction. The package left me rattled, but nothing else happened for a long time. I tried to move on, convincing myself that it had to be a joke, some sick game by someone who knew about my assignment. I even considered throwing the notebook away, but couldn't bring myself to do it. Then, about 6 months later, I started hearing tapping on my apartment windows. I live on the 3rd floor. At first, I tried to dismiss it as something explainable, branches scraping against the glass or a bird pecking. Maybe, but the pattern of the tapping was too deliberate. It would happen in bursts, 3 taps, then a pause, then another 3. It was rhythmic, purposeful, and worst of all, it always happened late at night when everything was still and quiet. The first time I heard it, I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I was too afraid to look, so I sat there on my bed, staring at the wall, willing the noise to stop. After a few minutes, it did. I convinced myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. The tapping continued sporadically over the next few weeks. Sometimes it would happen 2 nights in a row, other times it would skip a week. I tried peeking out once or twice, but I never saw anything. It was like whatever, or whoever, was doing it knew the exact moment to stop. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed up late, sitting in the dark with my phone in hand, ready to record if the tapping started again. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., I heard it, 3 sharp taps on the living room window. I held my breath and turned on the camera, creeping toward the sound. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady. I yanked the curtain aside and pointed the camera out into the night. Nothing, just the empty street below and the faint glow of a street lamp. But as I stood there, staring into the darkness, I felt it again, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the window, my heart nearly stopped. There, pressed against the glass, was a handprint. It hadn't been there before. The print was smeared, like whoever had made it was dragging their hand down the window. I stumbled back, clutching my phone, and immediately called the police. They came quickly, but by the time they arrived, the handprint was gone. There was no sign of anyone outside, and the officers chalked it up to condensation or my imagination. But I knew what I saw. The tapping stopped for a while after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started noticing small, unsettling things around my apartment. Items out of place, doors left ajar that I was sure I closed, faint scratches on the inside of my windowsill. I even found muddy footprints on my balcony one morning, despite the fact that my my apartment is on the 3rd floor and there's no easy way to access it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of tapping, but this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside my bedroom. The sound was faint, like someone was gently tapping their fingers against the wall. My chest tightened, and I lay there paralyzed with fear, straining to hear. The tapping moved, slowly, from one side of the room to the other. It was deliberate, like whatever was making the noise wanted me to know it was there. Finally, I mustered the courage to reach for my phone and turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and for a moment, the room seemed empty. But then, in the corner near the closet, I saw it. A figure, pale, gaunt, and impossibly tall, crouched in the shadows. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth twisted into a grin that was far too wide for its face. It stared at me, unmoving, as if it was waiting for me to do something. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I bolted from the bed, throwing the door open and running out of the apartment. I didn't stop until I was outside, surrounded by the glare of streetlights and the sound of passing cars. I haven't been back to the apartment since. I moved out the next day, breaking the lease without a second thought. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. To this day, I keep the blinds closed at night, and I never sleep in complete darkness. But sometimes, when I'm alone and everything is quiet, I still hear the tapping. This happened about 6 years ago when I was in college. There was an annual book sale in the basement of our student union. Most of the time, it was a quiet affair with tables of used books, students browsing through stacks, and volunteers manning the cash boxes. I loved going every year because the deals were great, and it always felt like a treasure hunt. That year, I went on the last day of the sale, hoping to snag something interesting before they packed everything up. The basement was quieter than usual, with only a handful of people around. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and there was that familiar smell of old paper. I was flipping through a pile of yellowed paperbacks when I noticed a narrow doorway at the back of the room. It was marked with a handwritten sign that said more books. I'd never seen it before, and curiosity got the better of me. The doorway led to a dimly lit corridor with more tables lined up against the walls. The books here were older, dustier, and more random. There was no one else in the corridor, which made the silence feel heavier. Still, I kept browsing. It felt like I was unearthing forgotten treasures. After about 10 minutes, I noticed a man at the far end of the corridor. He was standing perfectly still, his back to me, looking at a shelf. I thought nothing of it at first, just another book lover, right? But then I noticed he wasn't actually browsing. He wasn't moving at all, just standing there, stiff as a statue. His posture was unnaturally rigid, and something about it made my skin crawl. I decided to move to the other side of the room, putting some distance between us. As I shifted to another table, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was soft, but in the silence of the corridor, it sounded louder than it should have. I glanced toward the man and realized the sound was coming from him. He was tapping his fingers against his thigh in a weird, deliberate pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. I turned my back to him and tried to focus on the books, but the tapping got louder. When I finally looked back, he had turned to face me. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his face completely expressionless. The tapping had stopped. I froze. He was too far away for me to make out much detail, but something about his stare felt rugged. It wasn't like he was looking at me, more like through me. My chest tightened, and I decided it was time to leave. I walked briskly back toward the main room, trying not to look over my shoulder, but as I neared the doorway, I heard quick, shuffling footsteps behind me. Panic surged through me. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. I just bolted through the doorway and back into the main basement room. When I got there, I glanced back. The man hadn't followed me. He was standing just inside the corridor, half hidden in shadow. His head was tilted slightly to the side, like he was curious about me. The tapping had started again, faint but steady. I backed away toward the exit, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. As I reached the stairs, he took a single step forward, still tapping. That was all I needed. I turned and ran up the stairs 2 at a time, not stopping until I was out in the open air. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but something happened a few weeks later that made me wonder if I'd really escaped that man in the corridor. One night, around 2 a.m., I was in my dorm room working on an essay. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, so I had the place to myself. The building was quiet, the kind of stillness you only notice in the dead of night. My desk was near the window, which overlooked the campus quad, dimly lit by a few scattered lampposts. I was deep into my essay when I noticed movement outside. A figure was standing near one of the lampposts, right in the middle of the quad. At first, I thought it was just someone taking a late night walk or maybe a student heading back from a party. But as I watched, I realized they weren't moving. They were just standing there, staring up at my building. I turned off my desk lamp, hoping to make it harder for them to see me. My heart started to race as I peered through the blinds. Even in the dim light, I could tell it was was a man, and he wasn't just looking at the building, he was looking directly at my window. I tried to convince myself it wasn't the same man from the book sale. I couldn't make out his face, but something about his posture, that stiff and unnatural stillness, felt eerily familiar. I told myself it was a coincidence, that it was late, and I was just letting my imagination run wild. But then, he moved, slowly, deliberately. He raised his hand. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized he was tapping his fingers against his thigh in the exact same pattern I'd heard in the corridor. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him take a few steps closer to the building. I grabbed my phone and dialed campus security, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons. When they answered, I whispered what was happening, trying not to let my voice carry. By the time I hung up, the man had disappeared. 1 second, he was there, and the next, he was gone, like he'd melted into the shadows. Campus security arrived about 10 minutes later. They searched the quad and the surrounding area but didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably nothing, maybe just a drunk student or someone passing through. But I knew better. I knew it was septic. After that night, I started keeping my blinds closed and my door locked, even during the day. I never saw him again, but for months, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, when I was walking across campus or sitting in class, I'd feel that same cold, crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was standing just behind me, watching and waiting. Even though I moved to a different city and started fresh, the unease followed me, lurking like a shadow I couldn't shake. For months, I was hypervigilant, double-checking locks, avoiding walking alone at night, and scanning every crowd for a familiar stiff posture, or tapping fingers. Eventually, life moved on, and I got a job, made new friends, and built a routine that left little room for paranoia. The encounters became a strange story I only shared with close friends, always ending with the same line, "Let's not meet." That was until 2 years later, when something happened that made my blood run cold. I was working late one evening at my office downtown. It was an open-plan space with rows of desks, the kind of place that felt soulless after hours when the hum of the coffee machine and distant chatter of coworkers disappeared. I was alone, or so I thought. I had stayed late to finish a report, determined to clear my workload before the weekend. Around 10 p.m., as I was packing up to leave, I noticed something odd on my desk, a book. I hadn't brought a book to work that day. In fact, I hadn't brought a book to work in weeks. My chest tightened as I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly. The cover was faded and yellowed with age, the title barely legible, but I recognized it immediately. It was one of the books I browsed in the basement corridor that day. I looked around, my heart pounding. The office was silent, and I could see no movement beyond the glow of my desk lamp. The security cameras, I remembered with a pang of dread, had been down for maintenance that week. I wasn't sure what to do. Tentatively, I flipped the book open. Inside the front cover, in small, precise handwriting, was a note. Tap, tap, tap. I slammed the book shut and grabbed my bag, leaving everything else behind. As I rushed to the elevator, I swore I heard faint tapping coming from somewhere behind me. I didn't look back. When I got home, I called the police. I tried to explain the situation, but I could tell they didn't take me seriously. No threats, no signs of forced entry, just a book and some paranoia. They promised to file a report, but I could tell it was going nowhere. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I kept the book in a sealed bag, intending to hand it over to the police, but the longer I stared at it, the more I wanted to throw it into the nearest dumpster and pretend it never existed. The following week, strange things started happening. First, I noticed small objects in my apartment moving, nothing dramatic, just enough to unsettle me. A chair pushed slightly out from the table, my keys not where I'd left them. Then, the tapping started. At first, it was faint and intermittent. A tap 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 on my window late at night, even though I lived on the 5th floor. Then it moved closer, on the walls, the floors, even my bedroom door. I checked with my neighbors, but no one had heard anything unusual. One night, as the tapping reached its loudest and most persistent, I shouted into the darkness, "What do you want?" The tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought I'd scared whoever or whatever it was away. But then, from the other side of the door, I heard it, a soft, deliberate voice mimicking my own. "What do you want?" I froze. My legs wouldn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The voice sounded like mine but distorted, like it was coming through a crackling radio. Then, the tapping resumed, louder and faster than before. I don't remember much of what happened next. I think I grabbed my phone and bolted out of the apartment, calling a friend to come get me. I stayed with them for a few days, too terrified to go back. When I finally returned, nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I broke my lease and moved across the country shortly after. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened, convincing myself it was a combination of stress, exhaustion, and coincidence. But every so often, I'll hear that familiar pattern, tap tap tap, pause, tap tap tap, and my stomach will drop. This happened to me about 3 years ago when I was working as a research assistant at a university. One of my tasks involved organizing and digitizing old documents from the early 1900 seconds. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but I enjoyed the solitude and focus it required. The documents were stored in an auxiliary building on campus, which was used for overflow storage. It was an unassuming structure, 3 floors high, and built in the 1950s. The inside was a labyrinth of hallways, shelves, and file cabinets. My workspace was on the 2nd floor, down a long corridor lined with flickery fluorescent lights. I usually worked there alone because the building wasn't used for anything else anymore. One afternoon, I was sorting through some particularly brittle papers when I noticed a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the wind or the building settling. It was that kind of place. But I persisted. It was a faint shuffling, like someone dragging their feet along the floor. I paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped. Shaking it off, I went back to work. An hour later, I needed to stretch my legs and decided to walk down the corridor to clear my head. The long hallway seemed even darker than usual, and I felt a strange heaviness in the air. I told myself it was just my imagination. Halfway down the corridor, I noticed something odd. The door at the far end, one I'd never seen open before, was ajar. The door led to a storage room filled with unused furniture and broken equipment. No one else should have had access to it. My gut told me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward the door, calling out, "Hello, is someone there?" No answer. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, save for a sliver of light from a high window. I stepped inside and scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to leave when I heard it again, the shuffling sound, but closer this time, and my heart jumped into my throat. It was coming from behind me. I spun around and saw nothing but the dimly lit corridor. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. I stood there, frozen, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could move, the lights in the hallway flickered violently, plunging me into darkness for a split second. When they came back on, I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, there was a figure. It was tall, its outline hazy, like static on an old TV. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I felt its gaze, intense, heavy, suffocating. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, but I finally snapped out of it and bolted. I ran back to my workspace, grabbed my bag, and didn't stop running until I was outside in the sunlight. I reported the incident to campus security, but they found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else had been in the building. I quit the research assistant job the next day and never went back to that building. A few weeks later, I found myself scrolling through an old university forum. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I searched for mentions of the auxiliary building. I expected to find nothing, just the usual posts about outdated facilities or broken heaters. What I found instead made my blood run cold. Buried deep in the archives was a thread from over a decade ago. The title was simple, "Weird Things in Building C." I clicked on it and started reading. The first few posts were mundane, complaints about drafts, dim lighting, and rumors of asbestos. But as I scrolled down, the comments became stranger. One user mentioned hearing footsteps in the hallways when they were certain they were alone. Another talked about finding doors unlocked that were supposed to be sealed shut. But the one that sent chills down my spine was from someone who described seeing a tall, static-like figure at the end of a corridor. The post was from 2007. The description matched exactly what I had seen. The hazy outline, the oppressive feeling, the way it didn't move but felt like it was staring right through you. One user replied, claiming it was just a trick of the old fluorescent lights, but the original poster insisted it wasn't. They wrote, "It wasn't just a shadow. It felt alive, like it wanted something from me." I tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but then I read another comment that mentioned the storage room at the end of the corridor, the same room where I'd heard the shuffling sounds. Someone claimed that the room used to be a maintenance office back in the 1970s. According to their post, a janitor had died there under mysterious circumstances. The story went that he had a habit of staying late, working alone long after everyone else had gone home. One night, he never left. Security found his body slumped over a desk, his face frozen in a look of sheer terror. There were no signs of foul play, but some people whispered that he'd seen something that scared him to death. By now, my heart was racing. I closed my laptop and tried to convince myself it was just a campus urban legend, a story passed down to spook new students. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew because I felt it, that suffocating gaze, the cold, unshakable presence. Over the next few months, I tried to forget about the whole thing. I buried myself in my studies, avoided that side of campus, and refused to talk about it with anyone. But every so often, I'd hear whispers from other students, stories about strange occurrences in Building C. A friend even told me she avoided walking past it at night because it gave her the creeps. The last straw came when I bumped into one of the custodians who worked at the university. We were chatting casually when I mentioned Building C, careful not to reveal too much. His face darkened immediately. "Yeah," he said quietly, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "That place ... it's not right. I don't like going in there, especially not alone. I pressed him for more details, but he just shook his head and muttered, "Some things are better left alone." I haven't stepped foot in that building since, and I never plan to, but sometimes when I walk past it, I feel that same heaviness in the air, as if something is watching me through the cracks in the boarded up windows. I thought I could leave that experience behind me, but things didn't quite work out that way. After avoiding Building C for over a year, I noticed something strange. The dreams started. At first, they were fragmented and nonsensical, like most dreams. I'd be walking down a hallway, not necessarily the hallway from Building C, but one that felt eerily familiar. The lighting would flicker, and I'd feel that oppressive presence again, as though something unseen was trailing just behind me. Every time, I'd wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. Then, the dreams became more vivid. I'd find myself in the same corridor from that day, only it felt endless, stretching far beyond what the building could logically contain. The doors along the hallway were round too. Some were cracked open, revealing dimly lit rooms filled with odd shapes I couldn't quite make out. Others were sealed shut, but from behind them came faint noises, whispers, scratching, sometimes low, guttural sounds that made my skin crawl. The figure always appeared, sometimes at the far end of the corridor, sometimes much closer. Its outline was always hazy, but the feeling was unmistakable. It wasn't just looking at me, it knew me somehow. It felt as if it was waiting for something. One night, I woke up to find myself standing in my apartment hallway, staring at my front door. My heart pounded as I realized I'd been sleepwalking, something I'd never done before. Worse, I had no memory of how I got there. I could have sworn I'd just been dreaming, walking down that same endless corridor. But now I was awake, and the oppressive feeling lingered. I decided to see someone about the dreams. A therapist suggested they were a manifestation of unresolved stress or trauma, which made sense to a degree. But no matter how much I talked or worked on relaxation techniques, the dreams persisted, growing darker each time. One night, something changed. In the dream, I was standing in the corridor again, but this time I wasn't alone. There was another person, a man in his late 40s, wearing what looked like an old maintenance uniform. He didn't look at me. Instead, he was staring down the hallway toward the figure. His face was pale, and his expression was one of pure terror. He mouthed something, but no sound came out. I stepped closer, trying to make out what he was saying. His lips moved again, forming words I couldn't understand. Then he turned to me, his eyes wide, and I heard a faint whisper as if carried on a distant wind, "Don't let it find you." I woke up screaming. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed answers. I did more digging, scouring university archives, old newspapers, and anything I could find about Building C. What I uncovered made my stomach churn. The janitor's death in the 1970s was real. I found a brief article in an old local newspaper. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but the article mentioned that his body was found in a disturbing condition, with no further explanation. I also learned that Building C had been used during World War II for something classified. The records were vague, but it was clear that whatever happened there wasn't entirely above board. There were rumors of experiments, testing psychological endurance, sensory deprivation, and other ethically questionable practices. What unnerved me the most was a single line buried in a university memo from the 1950s. Due to persistent incidents, access to the second floor corridor will remain restricted after hours. The incidents weren't specified, but my gut told me they were tied to whatever presence haunted that building. I moved away after graduation, thinking that would finally sever the connection. For a while, it seemed to work. The dream stopped, and I started to feel like myself again. But last week, I got a package in the mail. There was no return address, and inside was a single photograph. It was of a corridor. One late summer evening, I found myself driving along a windy coastal road in Northern California. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and a dense fog rolled in from the ocean, blanketing everything in an eerie, muted gray. I was heading home from visiting friends in a nearby town, and while the drive usually took only an hour, the poor visibility made it feel endless. I was alone, or so I thought. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed something peculiar. The headlights of a car appeared in my rearview mirror, faint and barely discernible through the fog. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was a public road, and it wasn't uncommon to encounter other late-night drivers. But as the minutes stretched on, the car stayed uncomfortably close behind me, mimicking my every turn and curve in the road. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just being cautious in the fog, keeping me in sight as a guide. Still, a gnawing feeling settled in my stomach. To test my theory, I slowed down, almost to a crawl. The car behind me slowed as well. When I sped up again, they matched my pace, their headlights never wavering. My anxiety deepened. The road I was on had no streetlights, trees, and the thick fog obscured the edges of the cliffs that dropped off into the ocean. There were no towns or gas stations for miles, just the twisty road, the fog, and the relentless car behind me. I considered pulling over to let them pass, but every turnout I encountered seemed too precarious. Besides, something in my gut told me it wouldn't make a difference. They weren't just following me to get ahead. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the faint glow of a roadside diner through the fog. Relief washed over me. I decided to pull in and wait there, hoping the car would pass me by. As I turned into the parking lot, the other car did something unexpected. It kept driving. I watched as its headlights disappeared into the fog, my heart still racing. For a moment, I felt silly. Maybe I had been overreacting, but I decided to go into the diner anyway to calm my nerves and get a cup of coffee before finishing the drive. The diner was nearly empty, save for an older man sitting at the counter and a young waitress. I ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, keeping an eye on the road outside. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. No sign of the car, just the faint hum of the jukebox and the clink of dishes behind the counter. And then I saw it. The same headlights from before, slowly pulling into the parking lot. The car didn't park. It just sat there, idling, its headlights piercing through the fog. My stomach dropped. The waitress noticed my expression and came over. "You okay?" she asked. "I think someone's been following me," I whispered, nodding toward the car. She frowned and glanced out the window. "Stay here," she said firmly before heading to the back. A moment later, the older man at the counter stood up. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his weathered face set in a grim expression. He walked outside without a word. Through the fogged-up window, I could barely make out his silhouette as he approached the car. The next thing I heard was tires screeching. The car peeled out of the lot, vanishing into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. The man came back inside, dusting off his hands as if nothing had happened. He nodded to the waitress, then to me, before returning to his seat at the counter. I wanted to ask what he had said to the driver, but something about his demeanor told me not to press. The waitress gave me a reassuring smile and said, "You should be good now." I finished my coffee and left a generous tip before heading back to my car. The rest of the drive was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been following me wasn't just some random driver, and I never found out what the man in the diner had done or why that car was so intent on trailing me. A few weeks passed after that unsettling night. I tried to put the incident behind me, convincing myself it was just a strange, one-off occurrence, but something about it lingered in the back of my mind, an itch I couldn't quite scratch. I told a couple of friends about when it happened, but their responses were dismissive. Probably just some creep, they said. Forget about it. I wanted to forget, but that proved difficult when small, strange things started happening. It began subtly. One morning, I found my car door slightly ajar in my driveway, though I was certain I had locked it the night before. Another time, I noticed a faint scratch along the side of the car, as if someone had dragged something sharp against it. I shrugged it off as random acts of mischief, perhaps from neighborhood kids. Then, one night, I was taking out the trash when I spotted something on my windshield. At first, I thought it was a flyer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a small, square photograph. My stomach tightened when I picked it up. It was a picture of the coastal road where I had been followed, taken from an angle that suggested it was shot from another car. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same stretch of road, the same dense fog. My car was barely visible in the distance, headlights cutting through the mist. There was no note, no explanation, just the photograph. That night, I barely slept. Every little creak of the house or rustle of leaves outside made me jump. The thought that someone had been close enough to leave the photograph on my windshield without me noticing sent chills down my spine. The following day, I reported everything to the local police. The officer at the desk was polite but unimpressed. "Probably just a prank," he said. "If it happens again, let us know." I left the station feeling even more unsettled. Whoever was doing this wasn't just playing a prank, they were watching me. For a while, things went quiet. No more photos, no unexplained scratches on my car. I started to believe it was over until one evening, as I was leaving work, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Parked across the street from my office was the car, the same one that had followed me on the foggy road. I didn't recognize the make or model. It was nondescript, gray, and unremarkable, but I knew it was the same car because of a dent on the rear bumper that I'd noticed during that eerie drive. It was unmistakable. I froze, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. The car's windows were tinted, and I couldn't see who was inside. I debated whether to confront them, but every instinct screamed at me to leave. I hurried to my car, locking the doors the moment I got inside, and sped away. In my rearview mirror, I saw the gray car pull out behind me. I drove aimlessly, making random turns and doubling back in an effort to lose them. My heart pounded as I wove through streets and back roads, but no matter where I went, the car stayed with me, a silent predator in the shadows. I finally spotted a well-lit strip mall and pulled into the parking lot, parking directly in front of a busy store. The gray car didn't follow me into the lot. Instead, it slowed as it passed, the driver's side window rolling down just enough for me to see a pale hand wave lazily out the side. Then it sped off into the night. That was the last time I saw the car, but the fear it left behind hasn't faded. I changed my routine, got a new job at a different town, and even moved to a new apartment. I check my locks obsessively and always keep an eye on my surroundings. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I hope they've forgotten about me. Months passed, and I started to believe I'd finally left the gray car and whoever was driving it behind. Life began to feel normal again. I kept my guard up, but there were no more sightings, no more mysterious photographs, and no more scratches on my car. For the first time in a long while, I started to relax. That sense of relief lasted until a random Tuesday night. I had just gotten home from work and was settling in for the evening. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a small building in a quiet neighborhood. I liked it because it felt secure, far away from prying eyes or random trespassers. As I made dinner, I glanced out my kitchen window, which overlooked the parking lot below. My car was parked at its usual spot, but something else caught my attention. In the far corner of the lot, under a dim streetlight, a gray car sat idly. My stomach dropped. I tried to tell myself it wasn't the same car, that I was just being paranoid, but the sight of it brought all those memories flooding back. I turned off the stove and stood frozen at the window, watching. The car didn't move, its headlights off but engine running, casting faint exhaust into the cool night air. I grabbed my phone and called the building manager, hoping they could do something about the loitering vehicle. While I was on the phone, I saw the car door open. A figure stepped out, cloaked in shadow. The person walked around the car slowly, almost leisurely, before leaning against the hood and lighting a cigarette. They didn't look up at my window, but their posture was unnervingly casual, as if they had every right to be there. The building manager said they'd call the police and asked me to stay inside. I hung up and kept watching, my heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the faint sound of a police siren approaching. The person must have heard it too, because they flicked the cigarette away, climbed back into the car, and drove off before the police arrived. I explained everything to the officer who came to check the scene, including my past experiences with the gray car. They nodded sympathetically but couldn't do much besides file a report. We'll keep an eye out for the vehicle, they said, though their tone suggested they didn't think it was a big deal. For the next week, I was on edge. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the parking lot for the gray car. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even though I never saw anything unusual. Then, one night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a faint tapping coming from my bedroom window. I live on the 3rd floor. For a moment, I couldn't move. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a tree branch or a bird, but I knew there was nothing outside that window except a sheer drop to the ground. Summoning every ounce of courage, I got out of bed and approached the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped as I got closer. I hesitated before pulling back the curtain, half expecting to see nothing, but there was something. Pressed against the glass was a piece of paper, held there by a small piece of tape. The edges flapped slightly in the breeze. I didn't open the window. Instead, I called the police immediately. They arrived quickly and searched the area but found no one. When they retrieved the paper from the outside of my window, they handed it to me in an evidence bag. Written on it, in large, messy letters, were the words, "Did you miss me? I don't know how they got up there. I don't know how long they had been watching me or what they wanted. All I know is that I moved out the very next day. I left everything behind, my furniture, my job, even my car. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to disappear." About a year ago, I decided to get my old violin restrung. It had been years since I touched it, but something about the sound of a violin had been haunting me lately. Every time I turned on the TV or walked past a street performer, there it was, a soft, mournful tune that seemed to follow me around. I found a small, tucked-away violin shop in my city. It had no grand sign above the door, just a single word painted on the window, "Luthier." The place looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Dust coated the windows, and the faint smell of varnish wafted through the cracked door. When I stepped inside, the shop was dimly lit, lined with violins in various states of repair. The air was heavy, like time itself moved slower here. Behind the counter stood an older man, hunched over an ancient-looking violin, working meticulously. "Need something fixed?" he asked without looking up. "Yes, just a restring," I replied, setting my violin case on the counter. He nodded, then carefully opened the case. The moment he touched my violin, his movements paused. His brow furrowed, and he stared at it for longer than felt normal. "This isn't yours," he said, his voice low. I was taken pointed aback. What do you mean? I've had it since I was a kid. My parents bought it for me. He shook his head, almost imperceptibly, and muttered something I couldn't make out. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Flipping through it, he stopped on a page and placed it on the counter. There was a sketch of a violin. My violin, the distinct scratch on the back, the slightly warped bridge, it was identical. Below it was a date, 1896. Where did you get this? He asked again, this time with urgency. I told him the truth. My parents bought it secondhand when I was 12. I hadn't thought about it since. The old man's face darkened. This violin belonged to someone who went missing over 100 years ago. I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but his expression didn't change. He explained that the violin had been made by a luthier in Eastern Europe for a young prodigy named Elise. Elise had vanished without a trace after performing at a small town concert in 1897. Her violin disappeared with her. Things like this don't just turn up, he said, his voice almost a whisper. At that moment, the shop door creaked open. A chill swept through the room, though I didn't see anyone come in. The man's face turned pale, and he backed away from the counter. Take it and leave, he said suddenly, shoving the violin case into my arms. What? But, leave, he barked, his voice trembling. I stumbled out of the shop, the case clutched tightly in my hands. When I looked back, the lights inside had gone out, and the door was firmly shut. That night, I dreamt of a girl in a white dress, playing my violin. Her eyes were hollow, her fingers moving with impossible speed. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but it filled me with a dread I can't explain. The haunting sound of the violin didn't stop after that night. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the lingering fear of the encounter in the shop. But the melody became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't random. It was a tune I had never learned, but somehow it felt like it was being played for me, or worse, at me. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was a passing thing, but one night, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of strings. It was coming from the closet. My heart raced as I stared at the closed door, willing myself to believe it was a dream, but the music was too real, too sharp. I finally mustered the courage to approach the closet. My hands trembled as I opened the door. The violin case sat there, untouched, but the air around it felt heavy, almost alive. I slowly reached out and opened the case. The violin lay there, looking ordinary, but the strings were vibrating faintly as if someone had just stopped playing. I slammed the case shut and shoved it back into the closet. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided I needed to get rid of it. I couldn't keep living like this. I drove to a pawn shop on the other side of town and tried to sell it. The shop owner, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, examined the violin closely. This is a beautiful instrument, he said. Where'd you get it? I gave a vague answer, not wanting to recount the whole story. He nodded and offered me a modest amount of cash, which I accepted without hesitation. I left the shop feeling lighter, as if I'd finally freed myself from the weight of the violin. But that night, the music returned. I woke up to the sound of the same haunting melody, but this time it wasn't coming from the closet, it was coming from the living room. My heart sank. I hadn't brought the violin back. It was gone. I crept into the living room, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and run. The room was dark, but the music was deafening, and then I saw her, the girl from my dreams. She stood in the corner of the room, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness. Her fingers danced over the strings of the violin, her hollow eyes fixed on me. The melody grew louder, more frantic, as if she were pouring every ounce of anguish into it. I froze, unable to move or speak. Her gaze never wavered as she played, and I realized the melody wasn't just music, it was a message, a plea. Help me, she whispered, though her lips never moved. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear and the weight of her presence. Eventually, she stopped playing. The silence that followed was deafening. She lowered the violin, her form flickering like a dying flame, and then she was gone. The next morning, I drove back to the pawn shop, desperate for answers. But when I arrived, the building was abandoned, the windows were boarded up, and the sign was faded and unreadable. It was as if the shop had been closed for years. The violin, the girl, the music, they still haunt me. Sometimes, I think about trying to find someone who might know more, someone who can help me uncover the truth. But every time I get close, I hear the melody again, faint and mournful, warning me to leave it alone. For a while after that, I tried to live a normal life. I avoided anything to do with violins. I didn't visit music stores or attend concerts. I even stopped listening to classical music, fearing it might bring the melody back into my mind. But the truth is, the violin, and whatever was tied to it, wasn't done with me. One evening, I was sorting through some old boxes in my apartment. I had been trying to distract myself from the lingering unease by cleaning out clutter. As I opened a box labeled miscellaneous, I felt a cold draft pass through the room. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop, a sheet of yellowed music paper sitting on top of the items in the box. I didn't put it there. It wasn't ordinary sheet music either. The notes were scrawled unevenly, almost frantically, as if written in haste or desperation. At the top of the page, a name was etched in faint, shaky handwriting, Elise. I stared at the page, torn between wanting to burn it and the nagging feeling that it held some kind of answer. Against my better judgment, I decided to take it to someone who might understand. There was a small music conservatory in the city known for its collection of rare and historical instruments. I made an appointment to meet with a professor there, a woman named Dr. Greer who specialized in musical artifacts and folklore. When I showed her the sheet music, her reaction was immediate. Her face paled, and she gently pushed her glasses up her nose as she studied the notes. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice tight. I explained, omitting the more supernatural elements of the story. She listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. "This melody," she said, tapping the sheet music, "is known among certain circles of musicians as the Wailing Song. It's believed to be cursed. Stories say it was written by a young violinist just before her death, Elise, if the legend is true. The song is said to call to the living, pulling them into her despair. Those who encounter it don't fare well." "What does that mean?" I asked, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Dr. Greer hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Those who hear it often experience strange phenomena, and those who try to play it vanish, just like Elise." I felt like the room was spinning. What should I do? She sighed and leaned back, looking older and wearier than she had a moment ago. "You need to get rid of it. Completely. The violin, the sheet music, everything. But you can't just throw it away. You need to take it somewhere where it won't be disturbed." I pressed her for specifics, but all she would say was that certain artifacts are best left in places where the restless dead cannot reach them. That night, I packed the violin and the sheet music into a sturdy case and drove out to the edge of town. There was an old chapel there, abandoned for decades, with a reputation for being a place where cursed things could be safely left. As I approached the chapel, the air grew colder. The melody began to play again, not from the violin, but from the wind, the trees, the very world around me. It felt like the song was alive, resisting my attempts to bury it. I stepped inside the crumbling chapel, placed the violin case and sheet music on the altar, and whispered a silent prayer. I don't know to whom or what I prayed, but I begged for it to be over. As I turned to leave, I felt a hand brush against my shoulder. Spinning around, I saw her again, Elise. She stood by the altar, her eyes hollow and sorrowful, the violin in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like the faintest breeze. Then she lifted the bow to the strings and played one final, mournful note. The sound echoed through the chapel, resonating deep within my chest, and then she was gone. I left the chapel that night, not daring to look back. The violin, the music, the haunting, all of it stayed behind. It's been months since then, and I haven't heard the melody again. But sometimes, when I pass by the chapel on my way out of town, I feel the faintest tug, like a ghost of a song calling me back. I was on my way home from visiting my parents. It was a late Sunday evening, and the drive was long enough that I promised myself a stop for coffee halfway through. I pulled off at a small, unassuming diner I'd noticed on previous trips but never entered. The neon sign flickered a muted open, and the parking lot was mostly empty. Perfect, quick in and out. Inside, the place was surprisingly well kept for how desolate it looked outside. A smiley waitress waved me to any seat I wanted. The booths were red vinyl, the kind that squeaked when you shifted, and the scent of coffee and fried food lingered in the air. I slid into a corner booth and ordered a coffee and a piece of pie. That's when I noticed him. He sat at the counter, his back to me, hunched over a plate of food he wasn't eating. He was thin, almost gaunt, and wore a faded leather jacket that had seen better days. His shoulders moved subtly, like he was talking to himself, but I couldn't hear a sound. "Regular." The waitress was at my table, coffee pot in hand. I nodded and glanced toward the counter. "What's his deal?" I asked quietly. She glanced at him briefly, then leaned in and whispered, "He comes in every night, sits in the same spot, and never eats. Harmless. Just poet." I tried to shrug it off, but there was something about the way his shoulders moved, like he wasn't just mumbling to himself, like he was responding to someone. My pie arrived, and I focused on my food, sneaking glances at him between bites. After a few minutes, I realized something unsettling. The man at the counter wasn't alone. There was a shadow in the seat next to him, faint but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was a trick of the dim lighting, but as I watched, the shadow shifted, leaning toward him like it was whispering in his ear. He nodded in response, once, twice, then stiffened and turned slightly as if he could feel me watching. I looked down quickly, my heart pounding. When I dared glance up again, he was staring at me. His eyes were dull, sunken, but they bored to me like he knew something I didn't. The shadow beside him seemed to grow darker, denser, as if it was feeding off the interaction. I wouldn't stare at him, the waitress murmured as she passed by. Her tone was gentle but firm, like she'd said it 100 times before. I threw a few bills on the table and left my coffee and pie untouched. As I pushed the door open, I heard the faint chime of the bell above it and the unmistakable sound of the man laughing, a dry, raspy sound that made my skin crawl. I drove home faster than I should have, glancing in my rearview mirror the whole way. Every now and then, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, but when I turned around, there was nothing. For a while, I managed to convince myself that it was just my imagination. I told myself I was tired from the long drive, maybe a little on edge from being alone in a strange place at night. But then, small things started happening, things I couldn't explain away. The first was the dream. It happened about a week after my visit to the diner. In the dream, I was back in that corner booth, but the place was empty. No waitress, no hum of the coffee machines, just me and the man at the counter. He wasn't eating, and the shadow beside him was darker than I remembered. It seemed alive, almost pulsing like it was breathing. In the dream, the man turned to me slowly. His face was hollow, his eyes even more sunken than before, and his lips barely moved as he whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was silent except for the faint sound of my breathing, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I kept the lights on for the rest of the night. Then came the noises. It started with faint whispers I couldn't quite make out. At first, I thought they were coming from outside, maybe neighbors or the TV left on in another room, but they always seemed to follow me. In the shower, in my car, even at work. I couldn't escape them. One night, I heard laughter, that same dry, raspy laugh I'd heard in the diner. It came from just outside my bedroom window. My apartment is on the second floor. I stopped sleeping after that. A few days later, I noticed something new. Shadows, darker than they should be, seemed to stretch toward me whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. At first, I thought it was paranoia, but the movements became more distinct, more deliberate. I caught one crawling across the floor toward me while I was sitting on my couch. When I turned to face it, it froze, then dissolved into the dimness like it had never been there. I decided to retrace my steps. Maybe if I went back to the diner, I could get some answers, or at least confirm that the man and the shadow had been real. Against my better judgment, I drove back late one night, hoping to catch it as empty as it had been the first time. But when I got there, the diner was gone. The neon sign, the red vinyl booths, the cracked parking lot, all of it was gone. In its place was an overgrown lot with no sign of recent activity. A rusted for sale sign leaned precariously against a post, almost hidden by weeds. I got out of my car, my legs shaky, and walked to where the front door should have been. There was nothing, no foundation, no debris, just dirt and wild grass. As I stood there, I felt it again, that suffocating sense of being watched. The air grew colder, and the shadows around me deepened unnaturally, even though the moon was bright overhead. And then I heard it. The laugh. It was closer this time, almost in my ear, and it sent an icy chill down my spine. I didn't look around. I didn't run. I just walked back to my car as calmly as I could manage, got in, and drove away. I haven't been back to that stretch of road since. I don't take late night drives anymore, and I've moved twice in the past year, but the shadows still find me sometimes. They don't move as often now, but they're always there, lingering in the corners of my vision, waiting for the moment I slip up and acknowledge them. After that night, I tried to move on with my life. I avoided driving at night, stayed away from diners altogether, and threw myself into work to distract myself. For a while, it worked. The whispers faded, the shadows grew less persistent, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I left whatever this was behind. Then I received the letter. It arrived in an unmarked envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for 4 words typed in the center. "You shouldn't have looked." My stomach dropped, and my hands began to shake. I scanned the paper for anything else, a watermark, an imprint, anything that could explain where it came from. Nothing. It was as if it had materialized out of nowhere. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone I told about the diner had decided to mess with me, but I hadn't told anyone, not a single soul. That night, the shadows came back. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes. I kept my bedside lamp on, hoping the light would keep them at bay. It didn't. The shadows crept in slowly, pulling in the corners of the room, stretching up the walls. They didn't move like normal shadows, they flowed, like ink spreading through water. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the foot of my bed, barely distinguishable from the darkness surrounding it. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its head tilted as if studying me. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its eyes on me, boring into my soul. My chest tightened, and I realized I couldn't move. It was as if the air itself had turned to concrete, pinning me in place. The figure leaned closer, and for the first time, I heard its voice. It wasn't a whisper or a laugh. It was a low, guttural sound that made my entire body tremble. "You saw us, now we see you." The lights in my room flickered, then went out completely. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked. The figure dissolved into the shadows, which swirled around me like a living storm. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The lights flickered back on, and the room was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I haven't slept much since. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. Objects in my apartment started moving on their own. Small things at first, like a book shifting into a pen rolling off the desk. But then it got worse. Doors slammed in the middle of the night. My reflection in the bathroom mirror would linger a second too long after I moved. And always, just at the edge of my vision, the shadows waited. One night, desperate and terrified, I decided to burn the letter. I thought maybe destroying it would sever whatever connection had been made. I lit a match and held it to the paper, watching as the flames consumed the words. For a moment, I felt relief. But then, as the last ember died out, I heard the laugh again. It was louder this time, closer. The room grew cold, and the shadows erupted around me, darker and more aggressive than ever before. The figure appeared again, its head tilting in that same unnerving way. This time, it spoke clearly. It doesn't work like that. I don't know what it wants from me. I've tried everything. Moving, cleansing rituals, even reaching out to paranormal experts. Nothing stops it. The shadows still follow me, growing bolder with each passing day. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever see something you're not meant to see, if you feel that creeping sense of dread and your instincts scream for you to look away, listen to them. I didn't, and now, I'm not sure I'll ever be free. I was working as a nighttime courier for a biotech company in a major city. My job involved transporting sensitive samples between labs across the city. The hours were strange, and the work required absolute punctuality, but it paid well, and I didn't mind the solitude. One night, my task was to deliver a package to a high-security research facility downtown. It was raining hard, and the streets were unusually quiet. I arrived at the facility right on time, parked in the designated visitor lot, and made my way to the entrance. The building was an imposing concrete structure with minimal signage, its windows glowing faintly in the rain. The security guard at the front desk scanned my ID and the delivery slip, then directed me to the freight elevator to take the package to the sub-basement. That wasn't unusual. Most facilities I delivered to kept their labs in secure lower levels. The guard pressed a keycard against a panel, and the elevator doors opened. Inside, there was no traditional button panel, just a single glowing button labeled B3. I hit the button, and the elevator descended smoothly. When the doors opened, I was greeted by a dimly lit hallway that stretched farther than I expected. The walls were white, almost clinical, but there were no doors or signs that indicated where I was supposed to go. I stepped out and glanced at my delivery slip for guidance, but it only said sub-basement 3. Confused, I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. The farther I went, the colder it seemed to get. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a cart with a single computer monitor perched on it. The screen glowed faintly, showing a cursor blinking against a black background. Next to it was a handwritten note that read, "Place delivery here and wait for confirmation." I set the package down on the cart and stepped back. The monitor flickered, and the cursor moved as though someone was typing. A message appeared. "Thank you. Please remain where you are for verification." That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The sound grew louder, like metal dragging against tile, and it was getting closer. My pulse raced, and I tried to convince myself it was just someone wheeling another cart down the hall. Verification complete. The monitor suddenly displayed, "You may live." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and hurried back toward the elevator. The scraping sound was louder now, and I could swear I felt vibrations in the floor as though something heavy was moving toward me. My heart was pounding as I reached the elevator and slammed the call button. The doors opened just as the sound reached its peak, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something rounding the corner at the far end of the hallway. It was massive, metallic, and spider-like, with glowy red lights that might have been eyes or sensors. I didn't stick around to find out. The elevator door shut, and I ascended in a nauseating silence. When the doors opened at the lobby, the guard was gone. I practically ran to my car, the rain soaking me as I fumbled with my keys. When I finally got home, I checked the delivery log for any new assignments. There was nothing, but the next morning, I got a call from my supervisor. He thanked me for completing the delivery and told me I wouldn't be assigned to that facility again. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than just a strange job. The memory of that metallic, spider-like figure haunted me. I couldn't decide if it was some kind of advanced security system, an experimental machine, or worse, something alive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowy red lights moving toward me. About a week later, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It had no heading or signature, just a typed message in small, plain font. "Thank you for your service. Your discretion is appreciated." That was it. No mention of the company, no follow-up about the job, and no further explanation. I immediately thought about quitting, but the courier service had always treated me well, and the pay was hard to pass up. Still, I made it clear to my supervisor that I wouldn't take any more night deliveries to that facility or any facility for that matter. He didn't question me. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. For months, I avoided downtown. Even when I got daytime assignments in the city, I found myself scanning every building for any sign of that concrete structure. I never saw it again. It was as if the place had vanished. Then one evening, just as I was beginning to convince myself it was all in my head, something happened that made me question everything all over again. I was at home, scrolling through my phone, when a notification popped up from an unfamiliar app I didn't remember installing. The icon was blank, just a gray square, and the app's name was a series of numbers, 173,045B3. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The screen went black for a moment, then displayed a single line of text: "Remain where you are for verification." My heart sank. I felt that same icy fear from the night in the sub-basement. It didn't make sense. How could this app know where I was? I immediately deleted it and turned off my phone, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me all night. The next morning, my phone had reset itself. All my apps, photos, and contacts were intact, except for one thing: my recent calls log was completely wiped. I told myself it was just a glitch, but deep down, I knew better. That was the last straw. I quit my job the same day. My supervisor didn't ask why, but I could see something in his expression, something that told me he understood. Maybe he'd had his own experience, or maybe he just knew better than to ask. Even now, years later, I feel uneasy talking about it. Every so often, I'll see a blank gray app icon flash on my phone screen for a split second before disappearing. I've changed phones, changed numbers, even moved to a different city, but it still happens. Always fleeting, always just long enough to remind me. Life after quitting the courier job was uneventful for a while, but the subtle reminders of that night never fully went away. Every now and then, I'd catch fleeting glimpses of the gray app icon or receive strange notifications with timestamps and codes I couldn't decipher. Each time it happened, I'd remind myself that I was far away from the city, from that building, and that whatever it was couldn't possibly follow me this far. At least, that's what I told myself. One evening, months after I had moved, I decided to clean out my email inbox. Buried deep in my spam folder was a message with no subject line, sent from an address that was just a string of random letters and numbers. Normally, I'd delete something like that without a second thought, but my curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The email contained only two things: a photo attachment and a single line of text. The text read, "You've been observed." I hesitated before opening the photo, but I couldn't stop myself. It was a blurry image of what appeared to be my old courier van parked outside the concrete building. The timestamp on the photo was from the night of the delivery to sub-basement 3. At first, I thought it was just a strange coincidence. Maybe someone in the facility had taken the photo for documentation. But then I noticed something chilling. In the reflection of the van's side mirror, barely visible, was a shadowy figure. Its shape was distorted, but it looked unnervingly like the spider-like machine I'd seen in the sub-basement hallway. The glowy red eyes were unmistakable. I deleted the email immediately, but it didn't matter. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. The gray app icon returned, this time staying on my phone's home screen no matter how many times I tried to delete it. My internet searches were interrupted by random redirects to websites filled with strings of gibberish. And then came the letters. Handwritten notes started showing up in my mailbox, each one containing cryptic messages like, "The process has begun, and you are part of the system." The handwriting varied, as if different people had written them, but they all had the same ominous tone. I had no idea what process they were referring to, but I was too terrified to try to find out. The breaking point came one night when I woke up to a loud humming noise coming from outside. I cautiously peered out my window and froze. Parked across the street, partially hidden in the shadows, was a black van. It wasn't the same van I had driven during my courier days, but it was eerily similar. The headlights were off, but the faint glow of a computer screen was visible through the windshield. As I watched, someone or something stepped out of the van. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, and it was too dark to make out any details. But what scared me most was that it didn't approach my house. Instead, it walked to a nearby streetlight and looked directly up at the camera mounted on the pole. Then, almost mechanically, it turned its head toward my window. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I grabbed a bag, threw in a few essentials, and drove straight to a motel on the other side of town. I haven't been back to that house since. I don't even know if I'm safe now, or if I've just delayed the inevitable. About a year ago, I started a new job at a regional airport. My role wasn't glamorous. I worked in the Unclaimed Baggage department. If a suitcase wasn't picked up after a set amount of time and no one contacted us about it, it ended up in our little corner of the airport where we'd log it, open it for inventory, and eventually auction it off. Most of the time, the bags were mundane: clothes, travel-sized toiletries, maybe a book or two. Once, we found a bag filled entirely with souvenir snow globes. Another time, someone left behind an expensive camera kit, which caused a bit of a stir among my coworkers. But then there was this bag. It was a nondescript black duffel, the kind you'd see everywhere. No tags, no identifying marks. It had been sitting in the storage room for longer than usual, and when I checked the logs, I saw it had arrived about 3 months ago. No one had claimed it, and the airline hadn't been able to track its owner. Opening bags was routine for me, but something about this one felt off. It was heavier than most, and the zipper resisted, like it didn't want to be opened. When I finally pried it apart, the smell hit me first: metallic, sharp, and earthy. Inside, there were only 3 things: a pair of muddy hiking boots, a crumpled map, and a jar filled with some kind of thick, dark liquid. The map was hand-drawn and detailed, with strange symbols I didn't recognize scattered across its surface. It looked old, like something you'd find in a history museum. The hiking boots were covered in dried mud, and the soles were worn as if someone had walked for miles in them. But it was the jar that truly unnerved me. It was sealed tightly, with no labels or markings, and the liquid inside was so dark that I couldn't see through it. When I held it up to the light, something floated to the top, small and pale, like a tooth or a fragment of bone. I called my manager over, who took one look at the contents and decided to report it to airport security. They weren't as curious as I was. They sealed the bag up and said they'd handle it. That was the last I thought about it until a few nights later. I was working late, finishing up some paperwork, when I heard a knock on the office door. The Unclaimed Baggage office is tucked away in a quiet part of the airport, far from the main terminals, and we rarely got visitors after hours. I opened the door, expecting to see a coworker, but there was no one there. The hallway outside was empty, but something caught my eye. Sitting on the floor, right in front of the door, was the same black duffel bag. I froze. There was no way it could have been there. Security had taken it. I distinctly remembered them walking away with it. And yet, here it was, looking exactly as it had before. This time, I didn't open it. I grabbed my bag, locked the office, and left as quickly as I could. As I walked to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The parking lot was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I told my manager what had happened. He assured me the bag was gone, security had logged it and sent it off for further investigation. He even showed me the paperwork to prove it, but I knew what I saw. And every time I pass that storage room, I feel a chill. I still work at the airport, but I've requested to transfer out of Unclaimed Baggage. It's been months since I transferred out of Unclaimed Baggage, and for a while, things seemed to settle down. I moved to the lost and found desk, which is more straightforward: keys, wallets, the occasional forgotten jacket, no strange maps, no ominous jars. I started to convince myself that maybe I had overreacted, that my imagination had gotten the better of me. But then things started happening again. It began with small, almost laughable coincidences. I'd be logging a lost item, and the system would suddenly freeze, only to display an error with the exact same timestamp as the night I found the bag. My office phone would ring, but when I answered, there'd be only static on the other end. One evening, I was closing up when I noticed something tucked under the counter, a piece of paper folded into a neat square. I unfolded it, and my stomach dropped. It was the same hand-drawn map from the duffel bag, down to the strange symbols and intricate details. Only this time, there was something new. A red circle had been drawn in one corner, with an arrow pointing to it and the words, "Not much time left." I threw the map away, telling myself someone was playing a prank, though I couldn't figure out who. None of my coworkers knew about the bag. I made sure of that. The next day, the phone call started again. Static, a faint hum, and what sounded like faint whispers, too garbled to understand. I tried to trace the calls, but they always came from unlisted numbers. My manager brushed it off as a technical issue, but I knew better. Whatever was happening wasn't random. That weekend, I decided to go back to the airport to retrieve something I left in my locker. The terminal was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound feel magnified. As I made my way toward the locker room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Sitting in the middle of the hallway was the black duffel bag. This time, I didn't hesitate. I turned and walked away as fast as I could, refusing to even look back. I didn't care what was inside or why it kept reappearing. All I knew was that I wanted nothing to do with it. The next morning, I told my manager I needed to take some time off. I didn't explain why, and to my relief, he didn't ask many questions. I packed a bag and drove to stay with my sister a few towns over, hoping that putting some distance between me and the airport would make things stop. For a while, it worked. No phone calls, no maps, no duffel bags. Until last night, I was sitting in my sister's living room, flipping through channels, when I heard a soft thud on the porch. My sister was out running errands, so I got up to check. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I spotted it. Sitting on the doormat, just outside the door, was the same black duffel bag. I'm writing this now from a hotel room several hours away. I haven't told my sister what's happening. I don't want to drag her into this. I don't know who or what is behind this, but it's clear they're not going to leave me alone. If you made it this far, take my advice. If you ever find a bag that doesn't seem like it belongs, leave it alone. Whatever curiosity you feel isn't worth what might come next. I barely slept last night. Every creak, every distant car engine, every faint rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I kept the lights on, but that just made the shadows sharper, more defined. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It startled me so much that I almost knocked it off the nightstand. When I picked it up, I saw an unfamiliar number. I hesitated but eventually swiped to answer. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then came the static, low, crackling, and faintly humming, just like the calls at the airport. But this time, the whispers were louder. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, almost pleading. I hung up and immediately blocked the number, but not 5 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. It was a picture, but it wasn't clear. It looked like it had been taken in a dark room, with faint streaks of light cutting across the image. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, and then my heart stopped. It was the black duffel bag. I grabbed my things and left the hotel immediately. I didn't even check out. I just drove. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to keep moving. I thought that if I kept going, if I stayed ahead of whatever this was, I could outrun it. But this thing, whatever it is, doesn't care about distance. I pulled into a diner at dawn, exhausted and shaking. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers nursing their coffee at the counter. I sat in the back corner and tried to collect myself. I still had the picture on my phone, and against my better judgment, I opened it again. This time, something was different. The bag was still there, but now there was something next to it. A figure barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and possibly thin, and bent at an unnatural angle, like it didn't quite know how to stand like a human. Its head was turned toward the bag, but I got the distinct impression it was aware of me. Watching it, I deleted the picture immediately, but the image is burned into my memory. I couldn't finish my coffee. I left some cash on the table and got back in my car, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that diner as possible. I kept driving, stopping only for gas and to stretch my legs. By the time night fell again, I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by empty highways and open fields. I decided to pull into a roadside motel, cheap, no questions asked. The room was dingy, with a flickery fluorescent light in the bathroom and a musty smell that clung to everything. I locked the door, slid the chain into place, and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. I didn't want to sleep, but my body had other plans. Despite my fear, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the window. At first, I thought it was a branch or some loose piece of metal outside, but when I looked, my blood ran cold. The curtains were drawn, but there was a silhouette on the other side, tall and possibly thin, bent at that same unnatural angle. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like nails dragging against the glass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared, hoping, praying that it would go away. Then it stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. I stayed frozen, my eyes locked on the window, and then I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock at the door. I don't remember much after that. I think I grabbed my car keys and bolted out of the motel room, leaving everything behind. I drove through the night, not stopping until the sun came up. Now, I'm sitting in another motel room, miles away, writing this down because I don't know what else to do. I'm tired of running, but I don't know how to make this stop. Every time I think I've left it behind, it finds me again, and I can't shake the feeling that it's getting closer. I used to work at a small, family-owned bakery in the middle of a busy city. It was the kind of place people stopped by for their morning coffee and pastries before heading to work. My shift started at 4 a.m., long before the first customer arrived. The bakery had a large walk-in freezer at the back where we stored extra supplies, bags of flour, boxes of butter, trays of frozen dough. The freezer was nothing fancy, metal shelves lining the walls, a single, dim light bulb overhead, and a thick, heavy door that always groaned ominously when you opened it. One morning, about a month into the job, I arrived for my shift as usual. It was dark outside, the streets quiet except for the occasional rumble of a passing garbage truck. I unlocked the bakery, turned on the lights, and started prepping for the day. Half an hour later, I realized we were low on butter. I grabbed my jacket, it was always freezing in there, and headed to the walk-in. The door creaked as I pulled it open, and the cold air rushed out to greet me. I stepped inside and began stacking boxes onto a cart. I heard the door creak again behind me, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes the hinges settled strangely after being opened. Then I felt it, the sensation of being watched. Turning around, I saw nothing, just the metal shelves and stacks of frozen goods. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks in the eerie quiet. I was about to wheel the cart out when I heard a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible tapping. It came from the far corner of the freezer, just beyond the shelves. I froze, staring at the spot, and it was too rhythmic to be the hum of the freezer motor. Hello, I called, my voice shaky and echoing in the small space. The tapping stopped. I waited, every nerve on edge, but there was no response. I decided I must have imagined it. The freezer played all kinds of weird tricks with sound, right? I pushed the cart toward the door and left the freezer, slamming the heavy door shut behind me. The rest of my shift passed uneventfully. I didn't tell my coworkers about the sound. I didn't want to seem jumpy or unprofessional. The next morning, it happened again. This time, the tapping started as soon as I entered the freezer. It was faster now, almost frantic. I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to shift, first in the far corner, then above me, then closer. I shouted again, louder this time. Who's there? The tapping stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I backed out of the freezer without even grabbing what I needed and slammed the door shut. I told the manager about it later that day, and she brushed it off as old machinery acting up. But she let me switch to a shift where I wouldn't have to work alone in the mornings. A week later, I overheard her talking to a repairman. Apparently, they'd opened up one of the ventilation shafts in the freezer. Inside, they found a small, crumpled sleeping bag, some empty food wrappers, and a notebook filled with unsettling drawings of the bakery and its employees. They changed the locks on the building and added security cameras, but I quit shortly after. A few months after leaving the bakery, I had almost managed to put the whole thing out of my mind. I had a new job at a cafe across town and a different schedule that kept me surrounded by coworkers and customers all day. Life felt normal again. One night, after closing up the cafe, I decided to stop by a nearby grocery store on my way home. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m., and the store was quiet except for a few other shoppers. I grabbed what I needed and headed to the self-checkout. As I scanned my items, I felt it, the same sensation I'd felt in the freezer. That prickling on the back of my neck, the heavy weight of being watched. I glanced around casually, trying not to seem paranoid, but no one was paying attention to me. A couple of aisles away, a man was inspecting a shelf, but he didn't seem out of place. I told myself I was just imagining things and quickly finished checking out. I stepped outside into the cool night air, clutching my bag of groceries. My car was parked a little farther out in the lot, under a dimly flickering street lamp. As I walked toward it, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. My heart raced as I picked up my pace, and so did the footsteps. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, dropping them in my panic. The footsteps were close now, too close. I whipped around, ready to confront whoever it was, but no one was there, just the empty parking lot, stretching into darkness. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I scanned the lot one more time. In the corner of the lot, partially obscured by shadows, I saw a figure standing still, watching. I didn't wait to see if they'd move. I sped out of there, heart pounding. When I got home, I double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows before crawling into bed, unable to shake the feeling that someone, something, was still out there. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was just a random coincidence, maybe someone who happened to be heading in the same direction, but I couldn't ignore the unease that lingered. About a week later, I found something tucked under my windshield wiper after work, a small, crumpled piece of paper. My stomach dropped as I unfolded it and saw a crude drawing of the bakery's walk-in freezer. Inside was a stick figure labeled with my name. I went straight to the police, but they didn't have much to go on. The cameras in the cafe parking lot didn't cover the far end where my car was parked. They said they'd keep an eye on things, but I could tell they didn't think it was serious. I don't know who or what is behind this. I've moved twice since then, and I've changed jobs again. I don't use the same routes or routines, and I avoid places with bad lighting or limited visibility. Months turned into a year, and life had finally begun to feel normal again, or at least as close to normal as it could. I hadn't received any more notes, drawings, or strange encounters. I'd started to believe that whatever had happened was over, that maybe it had just been some sick prank that had run its course. But I was wrong. One evening, after a long shift shift at my new job, I was walking back to my apartment. I lived in a busy area with plenty of foot traffic, so I felt relatively safe, even at night. The street lights were bright, and the sidewalks were crowded with people heading to and from bars and restaurants. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything unusual to happen. As I approached my building, I noticed something odd. My apartment's window on the 3rd floor was glowing faintly. It wasn't the usual warm light of a lamp. It was cold and bluish, almost like the flicker of a TV. But I hadn't left anything on. The chill ran down my spine. I stopped in my tracks and stared at the window. The light went out. Just like that, in an instant, I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a trick of the light or a reflection from a passing car. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I took a deep breath and went inside, trying to act like everything was fine. The building was quiet as I climbed the stairs to my floor. Too quiet. Usually, I could hear muffled voices from my neighbor's apartments or the hum of the old elevator. Tonight, there was nothing, just the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the stairwell. When I reached my door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and I noticed it was slightly ajar. Not enough to be obvious, but just enough that I could see the faintest crack of darkness inside. I hadn't left it open. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The apartment was dark and still. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. I flicked on the lights, my eyes darted around the room. Everything looked normal, my furniture, my books, the small plants on the windowsill. But then I noticed the smell, a faint, metallic tang, like rust or blood. The freezer door in my tiny kitchen was open, not the fridge, the freezer. And inside, I saw something that made my stomach churn. A single piece of paper, folded neatly and placed on the top shelf. I didn't want to touch it, but I had to know. With trembling hands, I reached in and unfolded it. The same crude, childlike drawing stared back at me. This time, it wasn't the bakery's walk-in freezer. It was my apartment, with a stick figure standing by the window. It wasn't labeled with my name this time. Instead, it said, "See you soon." I dropped the paper and ran out of the apartment, leaving the door wide open. I didn't stop until I was outside, surrounded by people in bright lights. I called the police, and they searched the apartment, but they didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. I moved again the next day, breaking my lease and leaving behind most of my belongings. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away. It's been 6 months since then. I live in a different city now, in a high-rise building with security cameras and a doorman. I don't use my real name anymore, and I've cut ties with anyone who might accidentally reveal where I've gone. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That somewhere out there, someone is still watching, waiting. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.